What would you find if you went back to the Permian period? It was an ancient era full of life and death. The Permian period was the stage for the largest mass extinction event in Earth's history, even more severe than the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. Almost all life was brought to an end. The Permian lasted for nearly 50 million years, from 299 million years ago to 252 million years ago. This period can be divided into three stages: early, middle, and late. We'll walk you through these three stages, step by step. The early Permian, a world of synapsids. We'll start, of course, with the early Permian. In the early Permian, some of the earliest tetrapods began to appear. These creatures are now extinct, but they were the ancestors of both dinosaurs and, later, mammals. These massive predators were definitely not something you would want to get close to. On land, the apex predators were synapsids. This group of species ruled the land before dinosaurs even existed. They're often called mammal-like reptiles and looked a bit like a cross between a dog and a lizard. They had very thick skin that could retain a lot of water, which made them well-suited to the increasingly dry environment. The most famous synapsid was the Dimetrodon, an animal you definitely wouldn't want to meet. At over 3.5 meters long, it was a carnivorous beast with a huge sail on its back. Being cold-blooded, it needed a way to regulate its body temperature, and this sail-like structure likely served that purpose, helping the Dimetrodon warm up or cool down at different temperatures. These giants also came equipped with a terrifying mouth full of different-sized teeth. Another animal you'd have to watch out for was the Gorgonopsian. These carnivores had huge canine teeth and looked a bit like a modern-day Siberian tiger. Some scientists have described them as the T-Rex of their era. They were fearsome predators that could take down anything in their path. Their favorite food was the Dicynodont, a name that means two canine teeth. But if you came across them, you'd be in luck, as they would likely become your lunch. These synapsids were herbivores and came in various sizes, from as small as a pet dog to as large as a cow. The Dicynodons looked like a mix of mammals, reptiles, and birds, with a skull like a turtle shell, a beak like a bird's, and even tusks for digging for food. Dicynodons were cold-blooded during the Permian, but in the subsequent Triassic period, some species evolved more mammal-like features to help them stay warm. Surprisingly, these creatures survived the coming catastrophe. It's important to know that if they had gone extinct, humans might not have evolved. We'll come back to the other creatures of the Permian, but for now, let's look at where they lived. The supercontinent of Pangea. During this period, if you were to look down at Earth from space, you'd see all the land masses clumped together into one supercontinent called Pangea. It was formed by the collision of two huge continents, Gondwana and Laurasia. The formation of this supercontinent had a huge effect on the climate. Before we get to the climate, let's see where today's continents were located within this supercontinent. Gondwana looked like a giant crescent moon. The top of the crescent later split to form Europe and Asia. The main body of the crescent contained what are now North and South America and Africa, while the bottom of the crescent would later separate to form India, Antarctica, and Australia. The crescent enclosed a sea called the Tethys Ocean, while the rest of the planet was one vast body of water, the Panthalassa Ocean. So far, so good. While you don't have 7 continents to choose from, you can set up camp anywhere on Pangea. Maybe you'd like a spot by the ocean. However, the big question is whether you'd freeze to death or get scorched. This depends on when and where you arrived.
The Permian climate and atmosphere. At the beginning of the Permian, Earth was actually in an ice age. If you stood in the southern regions of Pangea, you would find massive amounts of glaciers, tons of them to be exact. These glaciers were located in what are now southern India, Australia, and Antarctica. Because of this giant continent, the weather would be very different from what you're used to today. In our modern world, oceans are great at absorbing heat. They warm up and cool down slowly, which helps regulate the temperature on land. But on this supercontinent, the interior was far from any water, so the temperature swings in this area were more extreme. By the middle Permian, you'd be enjoying a warm, moist climate. The glaciers had retreated, and the interior of Pangea was becoming arid. According to the Pangean mega-monsoon theory, there would be extreme seasonal swings throughout the year, with alternating wet and dry seasons. As the temperature continued to rise, the late Permian would become very dry, with some alternating warm and cool periods. What about the oxygen in the atmosphere? Would there be enough for you to survive? In the early Permian, the oxygen concentration was actually quite high, reaching 30%. This was because in the preceding Carboniferous period, forests covered the planet, creating an oxygen-rich environment. You might enjoy this extra oxygen, feeling more energetic. If you lived in a mountainous area, you'd feel more comfortable as the thin air would be offset by the higher oxygen concentration. However, as good as extra oxygen may sound, breathing this level of oxygen for an extended period would be bad for you. Over time, you could develop oxygen toxicity, which could lead to breathing problems and, in severe cases, seizures and death. But the high oxygen levels didn't last the entire Permian period. By the end, the oxygen concentration had dropped significantly.
Permian flora and fauna. Before all that, you're probably wondering what there is to eat. As temperatures rose during the Permian, plants began to thrive, but your options for food weren't great. In the early Permian, there were both polar swamp regions and tropical swamp forests. However, as the climate became drier, the swamp forests gradually disappeared, and moisture-loving plants shrank into shrubs. So unless you had teeth and a stomach like a cow, chewing on these dry shrubs wouldn't be much fun. Unfortunately, these shrubs produced neither fruits nor berries, which didn't really evolve until the Jurassic period, so you would likely be at risk of scurvy. There was one type of plant that was plentiful though: ferns. Ferns were the main type of plant at the time. Maybe you could eat some tender fern fronds or make some tea from tree bark. It's no hamburger, but it's something. Some of the plants could also be dangerous as you're not used to them, and they might trigger some kind of fatal allergic reaction. But nasty plants aren't your only food source. Why not try some nasty insects? With the thriving plants of the time, insects found a home. During the Permian, insects with sucking mouthparts emerged. You'd also see huge dragonflies flying around. Maybe you could try to catch one. Who knows, it might taste like chicken. You'd also notice that these insects were very large. In the early Permian, large insects from the Carboniferous period were still around. By the middle Permian, these giant insects disappeared, leaving behind smaller insects that still exist today. However, a roasted herbivorous Dicynodon would be nice. It's no spicy chicken sandwich, but it might fill you up. Another creature from the early Permian was the Varanops, a small lizard-like animal that fed mainly on insects. Another important group of animals during the Permian were the Lepidosaurs, which were basically reptiles. In the Permian, the Synapsids were dominant, while Lepidosaurs remained small and lizard-like. However, they would make a glorious return in their later evolution. What about fishing? You could perhaps try some fish dishes. The Permian oceans were full of bony fish, which had two distinct features: delicate fins and thick scales. The seas also contained creatures called ammonites, which had spiraling, coiled shells. While it's no ultimate shrimp scampi, a seafood meal might be your best bet. However, if you went swimming in the ocean, you'd have to be careful. You'd need to stay away from the terrifying Helicoprion, a shark-like creature with a deadly spiral of teeth and a 2-meter-long skull. This animal was much bigger than you at 2.5 meters long and could open its mouth and suck in its prey. The good news is that it was slow-moving, so if you were a good swimmer, you might be able to escape.
The Great Dying, the Permian-Triassic extinction event. However, not all life flourished during this time. By the late Permian, you would find that things were changing.
The creatures on Earth were experiencing a great extinction. It was the largest species extinction event on Earth, with 90% of marine life and 70% of land animals and plants disappearing in the extinction. To this day, scientists still aren't exactly sure what caused this great extinction, but there are several theories. One of the main theories is that a series of natural disasters may have been the cause of it all. In the late Permian, massive volcanic eruptions occurred in what is now Siberia. These weren't eruptions that lasted for a few years or decades, but for about 600,000 years. Huge amounts of lava flooded the area. However, it wasn't the lava that caused the extinction, but the gases released by the volcanoes, especially sulfur dioxide. These gases went into the atmosphere, causing acid rain. Volcanic ash was also shot into the sky, blocking out the sun and plunging the Earth into darkness, causing temperatures to drop. As a result, plants struggled to photosynthesize, and the food chain was destroyed. When the plants went extinct, the herbivores went extinct, and eventually the carnivores went extinct, like a row of dominoes falling one after another. But it wasn't just the destruction of the food chain. Breathing also became increasingly difficult. The extinction of plants had a major effect on the atmosphere. As photosynthesis ceased, carbon dioxide concentrations rose and oxygen levels dropped to 16%. Animals that had evolved in an oxygen-rich environment couldn't adapt to this sudden drop in oxygen and subsequently went extinct. If you're alive at the time, it would feel like you were on top of the world's highest mountain today, where breathing is extremely difficult. At the same time this was happening, animals that lived at high altitudes suddenly found that the oxygen in the air was no longer sufficient for their needs. As a result, they may have migrated to lower altitudes and had to compete with other species. Some scientists believe that this is what caused the land extinction. Oxygen levels were so low that animals had to stay where the air was densest, sea level. Even a slight climb upward would leave them gasping for air. At the same time, the increase in carbon dioxide also caused the greenhouse effect. Temperatures rose and the oceans warmed, which in turn caused the deaths of a large number of marine creatures. The rising temperatures and reduced oxygen created an extremely hostile world for all life, making survival almost impossible. But there is a third theory. Initially, scientists estimated that the Great Extinction happened over millions of years. However, more recent archaeological evidence suggests that the extinction event may have happened more quickly, possibly between 8,000 and 100,000 years. Were there other factors that contributed to the sudden extinction of these creatures? Yes, some scientists believe there was another culprit, an asteroid. In addition to the volcanic eruptions, scientists have also found evidence of an asteroid collision. This asteroid may have been 6 to 12 kilometers wide, larger than Mount Everest. So it may have been a combination of these factors: volcanic eruptions, climate effects, and a huge asteroid impact that became the final straw for life on Earth. The three combined to create the largest species extinction event on Earth. However, not all creatures went extinct. Some managed to survive. The Dicynodons later evolved into Cynodons and lived alongside the dinosaurs. Although they weren't at the top of the food chain, surviving was better than going extinct. They even outlived the dinosaurs and eventually evolved into modern-day mammals. Small sharks migrated to the deep sea, avoiding the acidic coastal waters. They still exist today. The Lepidosaurian reptiles also survived. The small lizards had an advantage in the struggle for survival. Compared to the large synapsids, their small size, cold-bloodedness, and slow movements gave them a better chance of survival.
In the subsequent Triassic and Jurassic periods, they evolved into the powerful dinosaurs. It was once believed that most trees also disappeared in the Great Extinction, but scientists are constantly discovering plant species that survive. Whether it's microorganisms, plants, or animals, life always finds a way to survive.